begin with a closely watched visit by the U.S. Treasury Secretary to China. Janet Yellen is in Beijing on a 4-day visit aimed at easing tensions between the world's two largest economies. Jung Chunying is live in Beijing with the latest on this. What is the latest on Yellen's visit?
Well, thanks, Mike. The Chinese government has so far not released any detailed schedule for Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. We know that she arrived on Thursday at Beijing Capital International Airport at the start of a 4-day trip, and am now right at the hotel where she's believed to be settled. According to a tweet by Yellen, she's expected to meet Chinese officials and some U.S. business leaders, and as she put it, is going to seek a healthy economic competition that benefits American workers and firms, and to collaborate on global challenges. Well, Yellen is viewed as very rational and pragmatic. We know that she has called many times for a healthy relationship between the two sides, adding that decoupling from China would be disastrous. So it's hoped by some that her visit to China will get China-U.S. relations back on a less hostile footing. The U.S. hopes to persuade China to refrain from reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds and instead increase them at the appropriate time to help the U.S. address inflation issues. And on the Chinese side, when it comes to China's goals, Beijing wants to reduce Trump-era tariffs on Chinese goods and sanctions on companies and individuals, which China argues not only hurt Chinese companies but also affect U.S. businesses as well. Well, just this week, China imposed export curbs on chip-making metals just ahead of Yellen's trip to Beijing. And according to some experts that I've spoken to, the two sides remain skeptical about whether there will be any major breakthroughs, any tangible results. They believe that Yellen's constructive role in dealing with China does not offset what they say is the increasingly belligerent approach by the Biden administration as a whole. But that's all from me. Back to you.
All right, thanks so much for that update. Josef Gregory Mahoney is joining us now from Shanghai. He's a professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University. Thanks so much for joining us. Of course, Secretary of State Blinken was just in China, now Yellen. What do we read into this? Are we seeing a bit of a thaw, do you think?
Well, you know, this is what we're hearing from Western mainstream media, that if we look at the headlines this morning and yesterday, that this trip aims to soothe strained relations, ease tensions, hopes to thaw the icy relationship. You know, of course, if we look at some of the more conservative-dominated media, it's being characterized as Biden kowtowing to Beijing. But I think this is a very modest visit. Both the Biden administration as well as China, and certainly the Yellen delegation have set very low expectations. It's simply that we're moving ahead with some of the high-level meetings as first promised during last year's G20 meeting between President Xi and President Biden, and this, of course, following 3 weeks after Blinken's recent visit to Beijing.
Some are saying the goal of these visits is basically to help the U.S. stake out a kind of new normal relationship with China. What do you think that new normal looks like?
Well, you know, it's really sort of difficult to describe in terms of new normal. You know, we have had these powerful aggressions from the United States, the CHIPS legislation. We've had the U.S. blacklisting more than 1,300 Chinese companies. We know that Biden is expected to sign this month or next month some curbs on outbound investment. There's some reporting that the U.S. is considering limiting China's access to U.S.-based cloud computing services in the near term. Washington is calling this targeted action. Yellen is describing it as, putting U.S. security interest first. In a speech she had at Johns Hopkins University in April that has been widely cited, she named 3 priorities. First was U.S. security interests, second, economic trade relations, and third, cooperation on issues like climate change, and that they would not be compromising on security issues. So in this increasing securitization climate, I think what we're going to see is not what she's said, that the U.S. is not going to be pursuing decoupling, but de-risking, which of course looks the same from Beijing's perspective, but this is, these are targeted actions. And I think as these continue to mount versus actually seeing reversals, for example, reversals on things like Trump's tariffs, which are still in place that haven't been reversed despite hurting both economies. The new normal from Beijing's perspective looks like just continued aggression.
Yeah, decoupling, de-risking, whatever you want to call it, trade between these two largest economies, though, grew again in 2022. So even despite these tariffs and trade war talk, the trade has grown between China and the U.S. for 3 years running now. Tariffs, though, still a big problem. You hear people in the business community here in the U.S. still clamoring for an end to the trade war. Can these talks lead to something concrete in that regard, do you think? I mean, there's really, when you look at this, it doesn't seem like there's any kind of actionable agenda here.
Well, your lead-in noted the fact that the U.S. is interested in China continuing to buy bonds to help the U.S. with its financial concerns. And certainly China has interest in buying things from the U.S. and, perhaps they can come to some sort of agreement where they'll be almost like prisoner swaps. The two sides will let some things go on each side. And of course, China has just recently announced the import controls for rare metals, gallium and germanium. So that'll certainly be something that they have at the table at this meeting. So perhaps they can work out a deal, but we've been told not to expect much.
Yeah, I've talked to lawmakers here in Washington who always say, if you want consensus, you start small, like an area where you can agree and then you grow it. And it does seem like the two sides could find common ground on climate change. Is that how you see it as well?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that I think China had really been optimistic for was that we would. I mean, this is when Biden first took office, this is what all the pundits were talking about, that climate change offered the opening for cooperation, but we've simply seen the relationship continue to go downhill since. And even when we talk to Green Party officials in Europe, they're not that interested in talking with China about climate change even. So even the people who would be most interested in doing so seem to have put this lower on their list of priorities. So I don't think that we can count on that, even though this is perhaps the biggest, most existential threat that we all face.
Josef Gregory Mahoney joining us from Shanghai. Thanks so much for your insights.